Gerald Bennett's silent mission. Gerald Bennett stared at the sprawling Los Angeles skyline from his penthouse office. At 48 years old, he had achieved what most could only dream of: CEO of Stellar Wings Airlines, a company that dominated the skies and set the standard for luxury air travel. But as he leaned back in his chair, a storm brewed in his mind. Despite Stellar Wings' reputation, murmurs of dissatisfaction reached him. Stories of unfair treatment, rude staff, and subtle biases crept through customer feedback, tainting the image of his airline. For weeks, Gerald combed through reports and reviews, desperate to understand if the complaints were isolated or indicative of a deeper issue. Boardroom meetings provided polished answers, but he knew they weren't enough. He needed the raw truth, unfiltered and unmasked. It was then that an idea struck, a bold, unconventional plan. Gerald would shed his CEO persona, blend into the crowd, and experience his airline as an ordinary passenger. No tailored suits, no entourage, no VIP treatment, just Gerald Bennett, the man. The idea exhilarated and terrified him. It wasn't just about policies or procedures. It was personal. He needed to see, hear, and feel what his passengers experienced. Only then could he understand the cracks hidden beneath the glossy surface. At 5:30 a.m., Gerald stood in his walk-in closet, staring at the rows of custom-tailored suits, silk ties, and designer shoes. Today, they were off-limits. Instead, he reached for an old, faded hoodie, a pair of worn jeans, and sneakers he hadn't touched in years. As he stuffed a duffel bag with essentials, he couldn't help but chuckle. His assistant, Carla, would have a fit if she knew what he was planning. When he explained his absence to Carla later that morning, her brow furrowed. "You're taking a day off." "Since when?" she asked, half suspicious, half concerned. "Since today," Gerald replied with a grin. "Trust me, the office will survive without me." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Gerald's secrecy was crucial. If word got out, the experiment would fail before it began. By 6 a.m., Gerald arrived at Los Angeles International Airport, blending seamlessly into the crowd. The chaos of LAX hit him like a wave. Announcements crackling over the intercom, travelers rushing through terminals, and the unmistakable hum of anticipation and frustration. Gerald's heart raced as he approached the self-service kiosk. It had been years since he handled his own travel arrangements. Swiping his credit card, he watched as the screen displayed his first-class ticket. Seat 1B perfect. He tucked the boarding pass into his pocket, grabbed his bag, and headed for security. The TSA checkpoint was a cacophony of organized chaos, Gerald observed with keen eyes. A sharply dressed man breezed through pre-check without so much as a second glance, while a mother with 2 small children was stopped and asked to empty her carry-ons. The disparity was glaring, but Gerald told himself to reserve judgment. He was here to observe, not jump to conclusions. When it was his turn, Gerald placed his belongings in the gray bins and passed through the scanner without incident. Yet he couldn't shake the image of the mother struggling to gather her belongings under the watchful eyes of impatient travelers. Arriving at Gate 22B, Gerald scanned the bustling lounge. Families juggled strollers and restless toddlers. Business travelers tapped furiously on laptops, and a group of college students laughed over a shared playlist. Gerald found an empty seat near the gate counter, his eyes darting from one interaction to another. A well-dressed couple approached the counter, inquiring about an upgrade. The gate agent greeted them with a wide smile and helpful demeanor. Moments later, an older man hesitantly asked a question, only to be met with a curt, dismissive response. Gerald's stomach churned. Was this what his passengers experienced? A hierarchy of worth determined by appearances. As the minutes ticked by, Gerald's anticipation grew. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers, jolting him from his thoughts. Joining the line for first class, he clutched his boarding pass, his pulse quickening. When it was his turn, the gate agent barely glanced at his ticket before raising an eyebrow. "Sir, this line is for first-class passengers," she said, her tone clipped. Gerald offered a polite smile and handed her the ticket. "I know. That's me." Her eyes flicked between his hoodie, jeans, and the boarding pass. Her expression soured. After an uncomfortable pause, she scanned the ticket. The beep should have been the end of it, but instead, she hesitated, picked up a phone, and made a call. Behind Gerald, the line grew restless. Whispers floated through the air. Did he try to sneak in? Why are they holding him up? The agent returned, her demeanor icy. "I need to verify some information with security," she said, motioning for him to step aside. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" Gerald asked, his voice calm but firm. She didn't answer, gesturing for the next passenger. The man behind him, dressed in a sharp suit, was greeted with a smile and waved through without issue. Gerald's frustration simmered, but he forced himself to remain composed. As Gerald stood to the side clutching his duffel bag, a security officer arrived. The officer's presence added weight to the scene, drawing more stares and whispers. "Is there an issue here?" the officer asked, his tone neutral. "Yes," the gate agent replied. "I need to verify his ticket and ID." "Something doesn't seem right." "Doesn't seem right," Gerald echoed, his patience wearing thin. "I've shown you my ticket. What's the problem?" The officer scrutinized Gerald's ID, glancing between the card and Gerald's face. "Everything seems fine," he said after a moment. But the gate agent wasn't satisfied. "I still think we should check with management," she insisted. Gerald's voice dropped, steady and commanding. "Do I not look like someone who belongs in first class?" The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The gate agent flushed, her confidence cracking. The murmurs behind them grew louder, passengers growing impatient and curious about the unfolding drama. As tension built, Gerald spotted a familiar figure rushing toward the gate, Carla, clutching a document. She had insisted on monitoring his flight details, despite his attempts to keep the trip discreet. "What's going on here?" Carla demanded, her voice slicing through the commotion. "This gentleman's ticket is under review," the gate agent stammered. Carla's eyes narrowed. "Under review." She handed the document to the gate agent. "I suggest you read this." The agent unfolded the paper, her face paling as she scanned the contents. It was an official letter identifying Gerald Bennett as the CEO of Stellar Wings Airlines. The whispers turned to gasps as the truth rippled through the crowd. But Gerald wasn't interested in basking in the revelation. Instead, he turned to the gate agent, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about who I am. It's about how you treat people when you think they're no one." The agent's face crumpled, her posture shrinking under the weight of his words. Around them, passengers looked on, their expressions a mix of shock, intrigue, and quiet satisfaction. Gerald inhaled deeply, the moment heavy with significance. He wasn't done yet. A silent awakening. The murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd at Gate 22B, but Gerald Bennett remained calm, his stance steady despite the chaos. He had expected some bumps during his incognito journey, but this outright dismissal, this quiet bias, was more blatant than he anticipated. It was more than just a hiccup. It was a stark reminder of the invisible divides that existed, even at the height of luxury. As Carla handed the gate agent the official document identifying Gerald as the CEO of Stellar Wings Airlines, a hushed silence fell over the space. The young woman's hands trembled as she read the letter, her expression shifting from confusion to sheer horror. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Gerald's voice cut through the tension, low and controlled. "This isn't about who I am," he said, his gaze firm. "This is about who you assumed I wasn't." Passengers nearby began to lean in closer, their curiosity now coupled with a strange sense of justice. Whispers of "Did you hear? He's the CEO, and she really messed up," danced through the air. Gerald didn't relish the attention. This wasn't a spectacle he wanted, but it had become one nonetheless. The gate agent swallowed hard and returned his boarding pass with shaky hands. I'm so sorry, Mr. Bennett. I didn't realize. Gerald interrupted gently. You didn't realize because I didn't want you to. Today, I'm flying as a customer, just like everyone else. His tone softened, but the disappointment in his eyes was clear. Tell me, though, if I weren't the CEO, how would this situation have ended? Her eyes darted downward, unable to meet his. Behind Gerald, the crowd was silent, as though holding its collective breath. Carla, who had been standing off to the side, stepped closer, her presence a quiet anchor for Gerald in the storm of attention. Sir, the security officer began, his voice cautious. It seems there's been a misunderstanding here. I'd like to apologize. Gerald raised a hand to stop him. Thank you, but this isn't just about apologies. This is about understanding how we got here. He turned back to the gate agent, who still stood frozen, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. You didn't mean for this to happen, I'm sure, Gerald said, his voice calm. But intent doesn't erase impact. As Gerald spoke, a woman in the waiting area, her toddler perched on her hip, took a step forward. Her voice was hesitant but clear. Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but overhear. I've experienced this kind of thing before. People assume things just by looking at you. Gerald's gaze softened as he turned to her. Thank you for sharing that, he said. It's not easy to speak up. The woman nodded. It's just, most people don't. They let it go. But when it keeps happening, it makes you feel small, like you don't belong. Her words struck a chord with Gerald, reminding him why he had undertaken this unorthodox mission in the first place. The polished image of Stellar Wings Airlines, with its glossy advertisements and promises of inclusivity, now seemed like a fragile facade. He wondered how many stories like hers were buried beneath glowing reviews and boardroom accolades. As the minutes passed, Gerald could feel the atmosphere shifting. The passengers who had once stared at him with suspicion now looked at him with a mix of respect and curiosity. The gate agent, still visibly shaken, whispered, I didn't mean to. I just thought. Gerald didn't let her finish. You thought I didn't belong, he said plainly. And that's the problem. What makes someone belong in first class? Their clothes? Their skin color? Their demeanor? The words hung heavy in the air, forcing everyone within earshot to confront their own assumptions. The gate agent's shoulders slumped, and she nodded slightly, her eyes glistening. I'm sorry, she whispered again, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to judge you. Gerald sighed, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. It's not just you, he said. This is bigger than one person. It's a mindset, a culture. And it's something we need to change. Carla stepped forward, her presence commanding. We have work to do, starting with our staff training, she said, her voice firm but professional. Mr. Bennett has been talking about this for months, and now it's clear why. As the gate agent nodded mutely, Carla turned to the passengers. Thank you all for your patience, she said. We'll be addressing this internally, but if anyone has feedback, we encourage you to share it. The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few passengers even clapped. Gerald, however, wasn't satisfied. He knew the applause was a small victory, but the real battle was just beginning. Finally, the gate opened, and Gerald stepped onto the plane. As he walked down the first-class aisle, he noticed the curious glances from other passengers. Some offered nods of approval, while others quickly averted their eyes. Gerald settled into his seat, his mind racing. As the plane taxied down the runway, Gerald replayed the events in his mind. He hadn't set out to make a scene, but the moment had presented itself, and he couldn't ignore it. It was a stark reminder that even in the most luxurious settings, biases and assumptions could lurk. He pulled out a notebook from his duffel bag and began jotting down thoughts. Training programs, he wrote. Empathy workshops. Real accountability. The list grew longer with each passing minute, the words pouring out like a flood. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Gerald had filled several pages. He paused, staring at the words. This wasn't just about stellar wings anymore. This was about setting an example for his industry, for his employees, and for himself. The flight attendant approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Bennett, can I get you anything?" she asked. Gerald looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Tell me, what's the most challenging part of your job?" The question caught her off guard, but after a brief hesitation, she answered, honestly, "It's dealing with people who think they're better than everyone else. Sometimes they're rude, and it's hard to stay professional." Gerald nodded. "And what's the most rewarding part?" Her smile widened. "When someone says thank you. It sounds small, but it means a lot." Gerald smiled back, her words resonating deeply. It was a reminder that change didn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it started with something as simple as treating people with kindness and respect. As the plane soared through the clouds, Gerald knew his journey was far from over. What had started as a quiet mission had turned into something much larger, and he was ready to face it head-on. The unseen divide. Gerald Bennett leaned back in his plush first-class seat, the hum of the plane's engines filling the cabin. The tension from the gate incident still lingered, not just in his mind, but in the eyes of the passengers around him. While some stared with newfound respect, others avoided his gaze altogether. It wasn't the recognition that unsettled him. It was the realization of how thin the veneer of equality truly was. As the flight attendant passed by, offering champagne and warm towels, Gerald observed her interactions closely. Her demeanor was polished and professional, but there was a subtle difference in how she treated each passenger. The man in a suit received a genuine smile and a light laugh at his joke, while the woman traveling alone was met with a more reserved, almost perfunctory tone. Gerald noted the disparity, scribbling quick observations in his notebook. He wasn't here to criticize individuals. He knew the pressures of customer service better than most. But patterns mattered, and they often revealed truths that numbers in a report could not. The in-flight announcement interrupted his thoughts, the captain's voice smooth and reassuring as he welcomed everyone aboard. Gerald glanced at the passengers around him, noting the range of reactions. Some settled in with contented smiles, while others seemed tense, their shoulders rigid. For a fleeting moment, Gerald wondered if any of them had faced the quiet, insidious biases that he had just experienced at the gate. His gaze fell on the young woman seated across the aisle. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with earbuds tucked into her ears and a tablet propped up in front of her. Her clothes were modest but stylish, and a small, worn backpack sat at her feet. Gerald recognized the guarded expression on her face. The same look he had seen in countless employees before they spoke up about issues at work. It was a mix of determination and unease. Curious, Gerald struck up a conversation. "Excuse me," he began, his tone gentle. "First time flying stellar wings." The woman blinked, pulling out an earbud. "Oh no," she said, her voice hesitant. "I've flown with you before. Well, not with you, but your airline." Gerald chuckled softly. "It's all the same." Her smile was faint, almost apologetic. "I saved up for months to afford first class this time. I thought it'd be different, special. But," she trailed off, glancing around. "But it hasn't lived up to your expectations." Gerald finished for her, his voice kind but probing. She hesitated before nodding. "It's not the service, exactly. It's how people look at me, like I don't belong here." Gerald felt a pang of recognition. "And how does that make you feel?" Her eyes darted to him, searching his expression for judgment. Finding none, she sighed. "Honestly, it makes me second-guess myself. Like maybe I was wrong to think I deserved this." Gerald leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "You know, I've learned something over the years. Belonging isn't about what others think. It's about what you know. And you know you earned your place here." The woman studied him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Thanks," she said quietly. Not many people would say that. Before Gerald could respond, the flight attendant returned, her tray of drinks balanced expertly. She paused at Gerald's row, her professional smile faltering for a split second when she noticed him deep in conversation with the woman. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Mr. Bennett?" she asked, her tone overly polite. Gerald shook his head. "No, thank you. But I'd love to hear your thoughts." The attendant blinked, clearly taken aback. "My thoughts?" "Yes," Gerald said, gesturing to the cabin. "What do you think about the people who fly first class? Do you think they're all the same?" Her brow furrowed, and she glanced nervously at the other passengers. I think they're diverse," she said carefully. "But I also think people have certain expectations of what a first-class passenger should look like." "And what happens when someone doesn't fit those expectations?" Gerald asked, his tone neutral but direct. The attendant hesitated, her eyes darting to the young woman across the aisle. "I suppose sometimes people make assumptions," she admitted. The conversation left Gerald with more questions than answers. He jotted down notes in his notebook, reflecting on the subtle but persistent divides he had witnessed. Was this just human nature, or was it something deeper? A systemic issue woven into the fabric of society and, by extension, his airline. The remainder of the flight was uneventful, but Gerald's mind was far from quiet. When the plane touched down and the passengers began disembarking, Gerald lingered near the exit, observing the interactions between the crew and the travelers. The young woman from across the aisle approached him as she prepared to leave. "Thanks for earlier," she said softly. "It meant a lot." Gerald smiled warmly. "Safe travels. And remember, you belong." Her smile widened, genuine this time, and she disappeared into the crowd. Back at the terminal, Gerald waited near the baggage claim, blending in with the throng of travelers. He watched as families reunited, business people hurried to their next appointments, and solo travelers navigated the chaos. Each person had a story, a reason for being here, and each deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of appearances. Carla found him minutes later, her expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "That was quite the flight," she said, handing him a coffee. Gerald nodded. "It was, and it's given me a lot to think about." Carla raised an eyebrow. "More than you already had." "Much more," Gerald replied. He held up his notebook. "This isn't just about stellar wings. It's about something bigger." As Gerald left the airport, he resolved to turn his observations into action. He had always believed that leadership wasn't just about profits or policies. It was about people. And now, more than ever, he was determined to ensure that every person who stepped onto a Stellar Wings flight felt like they belonged, no matter who they were or where they came from. The ripple effect. The sleek black car whisked Gerald Bennett away from the airport, the hum of the engine a soothing backdrop to his racing thoughts. His driver, James, remained silent as always, respecting Gerald's need for quiet reflection. But the events of the day replayed in Gerald's mind like a looped video, each moment revealing more than just a gate agent's mistake. It was a symptom of a larger issue, a culture of bias that had somehow seeped into his airline, despite all his efforts to build a brand centered on excellence and inclusivity. As the car navigated through Los Angeles traffic, Gerald opened his notebook and began flipping through the pages. Notes on customer interactions, the subtleties of service disparities, and the unspoken judgments he'd witnessed filled the pages. Each observation stung, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed what he had feared. Stellar Wings had work to do, and it had to start from the top. By the time Gerald arrived at his penthouse apartment, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, golden glow. He stepped into his home office, a space filled with awards, framed photos, and mementos of his journey from humble beginnings to CEO. But tonight, those symbols of success felt hollow. He sat at his desk, staring at the glowing cityscape through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Pulling out his laptop, He began drafting an email to his executive team. Subject: Immediate Action Plan. Addressing bias and culture at Stellar Wings. Dear team, today I had the opportunity to experience Stellar Wings through the eyes of a passenger. What I witnessed was both enlightening and troubling. While our staff demonstrates professionalism and competence, there are underlying issues that we must address, issues of bias, assumption, and perception. I am calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning to discuss a comprehensive plan to tackle these challenges. This will not be a superficial effort. We will review our training programs, hiring practices, and overall company culture to ensure that we live up to the values we proudly display. Change starts with us, and I expect each of you to bring ideas, solutions, and an open mind to the table. Sincerely, Gerald Bennett, CEO, Stellar Wings Airlines. Satisfied but still restless, Gerald hit send and leaned back in his chair. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him, but it also fueled his determination. This was his airline, his responsibility, and he would not let it falter. The next morning, Gerald arrived at the Stellar Wings headquarters earlier than usual. The building was a testament to modern architecture, with its glass facade and sleek interiors. As he walked through the lobby, employees greeted him warmly, unaware of the internal storm brewing within their CEO. By 9:00 a.m., the executive team was gathered in the boardroom. The atmosphere was charged, a mix of curiosity and apprehension hanging in the air. Gerald stood at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence amplified by the gravity of the moment. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to sugarcoat anything. Yesterday, I went undercover as a passenger on one of our flights. What I experienced was eye-opening." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every executive hanging on his next sentence. While many aspects of our service are commendable, I witnessed moments of bias, both subtle and overt. And these moments are not just isolated incidents. They reflect a culture that we must change. Gerald glanced around the room, his gaze sharp. "Let me be clear. Stellar Wings is not just a brand. It's a promise to treat every passenger with dignity, respect, and fairness. If we fail in that, we fail completely." Over the next hour, Gerald outlined his plan. The team would implement mandatory training sessions focused on unconscious bias and empathy. Customer feedback mechanisms would be overhauled to ensure that every voice was heard. Hiring practices would be reviewed to promote diversity and inclusivity. And most importantly, accountability would become a cornerstone of their culture. The executives nodded, some taking notes while others exchanged thoughtful glances. Gerald could sense the wheels turning, the realization dawning that this wasn't just another corporate initiative, it was a transformation. After the meeting, Gerald retreated to his office, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but the first step had been taken. As he stared out at the city, his phone buzzed with a notification. A social media post from a passenger on yesterday's flight had gone viral. The caption read, "Witnessed something incredible yesterday. The CEO of Stellar Wings stood up for fairness and respect in a way I'll never forget. This is the kind of leadership we need." The comments were a flood of praise, stories of passengers' own experiences, and calls for broader change across the industry. Gerald's heart swelled, not with pride, but with hope. The ripple effect had begun. That evening, Gerald received a handwritten letter from the young woman he had spoken to on a flight. Her words were raw and heartfelt. "Dear Mr. Bennett, thank you for taking the time to listen to me yesterday. You reminded me that I do belong, even when the world makes me feel otherwise. I've never had someone in your position speak to me with such kindness and understanding. It meant more than you know. Sincerely, Maya." Gerald placed the letter on his desk, a quiet reminder of why he had started this journey. It wasn't about proving a point or making headlines. It was about creating a space where everyone, from passengers to employees, felt seen, valued, and respected. And he wouldn't stop until that vision became a reality. The hidden costs of assumptions. Gerald Bennett sat in his corner office, the sun casting long shadows across the Los Angeles skyline. The city buzzed with its usual energy, but Gerald's mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with the events of the past few days. His undercover experience as an anonymous passenger had exposed cracks in the culture of Stellar Wings Airlines, and the realization was still sinking in. The handwritten letter from Maya, the young woman he had met on the flight, sat on his desk. Her words haunted him, not because of their sincerity, but because they echoed a sentiment he had heard countless times before, the feeling of not belonging. But this wasn't just about Maya, or the gate agent, or even the passengers. It was about a system, a culture that had quietly normalized these experiences. Gerald was determined to confront it head-on. The morning buzz of the office was interrupted by a knock at Gerald's door. Carla stepped in, holding a stack of reports and her tablet. "Morning, sir," she said, her tone brisk. "The team compiled data on our customer feedback, employee reviews, and incident reports from the last year. It's revealing." Gerald gestured for her to sit. "Let's hear it." Carla opened the first report. "We've identified a pattern," she began. "While overall customer satisfaction remains high, there's a disproportionate number of complaints from certain demographics: minorities, solo travelers, and younger passengers." Gerald frowned, leaning forward. "What kind of complaints?" "Subtle bias," Carla replied. "Being overlooked for upgrades, receiving dismissive responses from staff, or feeling unwelcome in premium areas like first class and lounges." Gerald's jaw tightened, and internally, Carla hesitated. "Similar patterns. Employees from diverse backgrounds report feeling undervalued or overlooked for promotions. Some mention being treated differently by colleagues or passengers." The words hung in the air like a weight. Gerald took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the reports. "What's the turnover rate for these employees?" "Higher than the average," Carla admitted, "especially in customer-facing roles." Gerald leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about perception. It was affecting the very foundation of Stellar Wings. The cost of assumptions wasn't just emotional. It was financial, operational, and reputational. "Carla," he said, his voice steady, "schedule a meeting with the department heads. I want a full review of hiring practices, promotion criteria, and employee feedback mechanisms. This isn't going to be a surface-level fix." She nodded, but her expression softened. "Gerald, this is big. Are you ready for the pushback?" He met her gaze, his eyes resolute. "We're not just running an airline. We're setting a standard. If that means shaking things up, so be it." The meeting later that afternoon was tense. The department heads, a mix of seasoned executives and rising stars, shuffled into the boardroom, their expressions a blend of curiosity and caution. Gerald stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding as always. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone calm but firm. "I won't mince words. Stellar Wings has a problem that goes beyond customer complaints and into the very culture of our organization." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every pair of eyes trained on him. "We've built a brand that promises inclusivity, luxury, and respect," he continued. "But recent experiences, both as a passenger and as your CEO, have shown me that we're falling short. And that failure starts here, in this room." One executive, a middle-aged man with a polished demeanor, cleared his throat. "Gerald, if I may, are we certain this isn't just a case of isolated incidents? Our metrics show that we're still performing well overall." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "Isolated incidents. That's what I thought, until I experienced it myself. When assumptions are made about who belongs and who doesn't, it's not isolated, it's systemic." Over the next hour, Gerald outlined a plan that left no stone unturned. It wasn't just about implementing new policies. It was about rethinking the very foundation of Stellar Wings. Hiring practices would prioritize diversity, not just in numbers, but in fostering an inclusive culture. Promotions would be based on merit and evaluated for fairness. Training programs would be revamped to address unconscious bias and empathy. And we're not stopping there, Gerald said, his voice unwavering. I want to hear directly from our employees and customers. We're launching an anonymous feedback platform and a series of listening sessions to ensure every voice is heard. The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Some executives nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Gerald, one executive finally spoke up. This is ambitious, but it's also risky. Changing company culture is a long, complicated process. How do we measure success? Gerald met the man's gaze. Success isn't just about numbers. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued, where no one questions if they belong. And if that takes time, so be it. As the meeting adjourned, Gerald lingered in the boardroom, watching as his team filtered out. Some left with determination, others with hesitation. But Gerald knew that change was rarely comfortable. Carla stepped back into the room, a faint smile on her face. That was bold, she said, but necessary. Gerald nodded, his expression thoughtful. Carla, I need your help. This can't just be a top-down initiative. We need champions at every level of the company. She grinned. Consider it done. And for the record, I think you're doing the right thing. That evening, Gerald reflected on the day's events. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew it was worth it. Stellar Wings wasn't just an airline. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people from all walks of life came together. As he prepared for bed, Gerald glanced at Maya's letter on his desk. It was a reminder of why he had started this journey, not just for the passengers who felt unseen, but for the employees who deserved to thrive in a workplace free of judgment. The hidden costs of assumptions were steep, but Gerald was determined to pay them in full, and to ensure that no one else ever had to. A new flight path. The following weeks marked the beginning of what Gerald Bennett would later call the Great Shift at Stellar Wings Airlines. What had started as a personal mission to understand the customer experience had become a company-wide reckoning. Gerald wasn't interested in half measures or cosmetic changes. He was determined to rebuild the culture of the airline from the ground up. But as the saying went, progress was messy. Listening to the unheard. The first major initiative was a series of employee town halls. Gerald wanted to hear directly from the people on the front lines, the flight attendants, gate agents, mechanics, and customer service representatives who made up the backbone of the company. He attended every session personally, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. The town halls were raw and unfiltered. Employees spoke candidly about their experiences, some recounting moments of pride, others sharing stories of frustration and disillusionment. A young flight attendant named Sophia recounted an incident where a passenger had questioned her qualifications based on her accent. It wasn't what he said, she explained, her voice shaking. It was how he looked at me, like I didn't belong in this uniform. A gate agent named Marcus shared his challenges managing passengers' expectations. When someone walks up and immediately assumes I'll mess up because of how I look, it's hard to stay professional, he said. But I try, every day. Gerald listened intently, taking notes and thanking each person for their courage. Your stories matter, he told them, and they're going to drive the change we need. Training for change. The next phase was implementing mandatory training programs across the company. Gerald partnered with experts in diversity and inclusion to develop workshops on unconscious bias, empathy, and effective communication. The sessions were interactive, challenging employees to confront their own assumptions and learn how to navigate difficult situations with compassion. The training wasn't met with universal enthusiasm. Some employees resisted, questioning the need for such programs. Gerald addressed their concerns head-on. This isn't about pointing fingers, he said during a company-wide webinar. It's about giving everyone the tools to succeed and creating an environment where respect is the norm, not the exception. One session included a role-playing exercise where employees took turns acting as passengers from different walks of life. The scenarios were eye-opening, revealing just how much small actions and attitudes could impact someone's experience. At the end of one session, a senior flight attendant named Linda approached Gerald. "I've been with this company for 15 years, she said. "I thought I'd seen it all, but this training made me realize I still have a lot to learn. Thank you for pushing us." The voice of the customer. While the employee initiatives gained momentum, Gerald turned his attention to the passengers. Stellar Wings launched a new feedback platform, allowing customers to share their experiences anonymously. The goal was to identify pain points and celebrate successes, creating a continuous loop of improvement. The feedback rolled in, revealing a mix of praise and constructive criticism. One frequent flyer wrote, "I've always loved the service on Stellar Wings, but I've noticed how some passengers are treated differently. It's subtle, but it's there." Another passenger shared a positive experience. "I had an issue with my seat, and the gate agent went above and beyond to fix it. She made me feel valued." Gerald personally reviewed many of the submissions, using them to guide the next steps in the company's transformation. He also made a point to celebrate the positive stories, sending handwritten notes of appreciation to employees who went above and beyond. Facing the backlash. Not everyone was on board with the changes. Some longtime employees grumbled about the increased scrutiny, while a few executives privately questioned whether the initiatives were worth the effort. Gerald addressed these concerns in a leadership meeting. "Change is uncomfortable," he said, "but discomfort is the price we pay for progress. If we're serious about being the best airline in the world, we can't ignore the issues that hold us back." One executive pushed back. "Gerald, we're a business. How do we balance this with profitability?" Gerald's response was swift. "By recognizing that our people, employees and passengers, are our greatest asset, treat them well, and the profits will follow." His conviction silenced the room. It was clear that this wasn't just a corporate initiative for Gerald. It was personal. A visible transformation. Months passed, and the effects of Gerald's efforts began to show. Employee turnover decreased, and internal surveys revealed a growing sense of pride among the staff. Customers noticed the difference too, with many commenting on the improved atmosphere and service. Maya, the young woman Gerald had met on his undercover flight, reached out again. She shared that she had flown Stellar Wings recently and felt a noticeable shift in how she was treated. "I don't know what you did," she wrote, "but it's working. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in first class. Thank you for listening." Her words brought a smile to Gerald's face. They were a small but powerful validation of the path he had chosen. The future takes flight. 1 year after Gerald's undercover flight, Stellar Wings held a company-wide event to celebrate its progress. Employees from all levels gathered in a massive hangar, the walls adorned with photos and stories of the people who made the transformation possible. Gerald took the stage, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This journey hasn't been easy, and we're not done yet. But together, we've proven that change is possible when we lead with courage and compassion." The applause was thunderous, a testament to the collective effort of thousands of individuals united by a shared vision. As Gerald stepped off the stage, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. Stellar Wings was no longer just an airline. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together to build something better. The flight path had changed, and Gerald was determined to keep soaring. As Gerald stepped down from the stage, the applause still echoing in the vast hangar, he felt a mixture of relief and determination. The journey he had embarked on was far from over, but this moment, the celebration of progress, was a reminder of how far they had come. Employees approached him one after another, some shaking his hand, others sharing personal stories of how the changes had impacted them. "Thank you for listening, Mr. Bennett," a young gate agent named Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Before, I always felt invisible, but now I feel like I'm part of something bigger." Gerald smiled warmly. "You are, Sarah. Every single one of you is an unexpected encounter. As the event wound down, Gerald noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Maya, the young woman from his undercover flight. She hesitated near the edge of the room, as though unsure whether to approach. Gerald waved her over, his grin widening. "Maya," he greeted her warmly. "It's good to see you again." She smiled shyly. "I heard about this event and thought I'd stop by. I wanted to see if everything you said back then was real." Gerald chuckled. "And what do you think?" She looked around, her gaze landing on the employees and passengers mingling together, sharing stories and laughter. "I think you kept your promise." Her words struck a chord, and Gerald felt a pang of gratitude. "I had a lot of help," he said humbly. "This wasn't just me. It was everyone who believed in making things better." Maya nodded. "Still, it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't started it. So thank you for listening, for speaking up, and for showing that change is possible." The next chapter. That evening, Gerald returned to his penthouse, the city's lights twinkling like stars on the horizon. He sat at his desk, staring out at the skyline, and let his thoughts wander. The journey had been challenging, but it had also been transformative, not just for Stellar Wings, but for him as a leader and a person. He opened his notebook, now filled with notes, ideas, and reflections from the past year. Flipping to a fresh page, he began to write. Lessons from the sky. Every voice matters. Whether it's a passenger or an employee, everyone has a story worth hearing. Listening is the first step toward understanding and change. Assumptions are the enemy. Judging someone based on appearances or preconceptions leads to missed opportunities and unnecessary harm. Leadership is service. True leadership isn't about power or titles. It's about serving others and creating an environment where everyone can thrive. Change starts with courage. Confronting uncomfortable truths takes bravery, but it's the only way to grow. Progress is a journey. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a continuous process of learning, adapting, and improving. As Gerald finished writing, he closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. A sense of peace settled over him, tempered by the knowledge that the work was never truly done. There would always be challenges, but now he knew he had the tools and the team to face them. A final flight. Months later, Gerald found himself at the airport again, this time preparing for another flight. He had chosen a random route, blending in once more as an ordinary passenger. But this time, the experience was different. From the moment he checked in to the time he boarded the plane, he noticed the subtle but profound changes. Employees greeted passengers with genuine smiles, interactions were thoughtful and respectful, and the atmosphere was one of inclusion and care. As the plane soared into the sky, Gerald couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Stellar Wings was finally living up to its name, not just as a leader in luxury travel, but as a beacon of fairness, respect, and humanity. The journey wasn't over, but it was on the right path. And for Gerald Bennett, that was enough. Epilogue. News of Stellar Wings' transformation spread across the industry, inspiring other companies to follow suit. Gerald was invited to speak at conferences and panels, sharing the story of how one undercover flight had sparked a movement. But for Gerald, the greatest reward wasn't the accolades or the headlines. It was the quiet moments when passengers and employees approached him with gratitude, knowing they were part of something extraordinary. As he often said in those speeches, the skies belong to everyone, and so should the respect we show each other. That's the legacy I want to leave. And he did.